The last thing my ex ever said to me was, "You'll regret ever crossing me." What he didn't know was that I had already been recording every single call he made to me for the past 6 months. Every apology, every lie, every manipulation, every moment he thought I was too broken to notice what he was really doing. And the night he finally realized it, he went completely silent. Not angry, not defensive. Silent, because he understood in that exact moment that everything he built was already gone. I didn't start recording because I planned revenge. I started because I stopped trusting my own memory around his. At first, it was small things. He would say one thing on a call and then deny it later like I misunderstood. He would twist conversations so cleanly that I began questioning myself more than I questioned his. And that's whose it started to shift, not with a big fight, but with confusion. The kind that slowly makes you doubt your own reality. His name was Lauren, and when we first met, he didn't feel dangerous at all. He felt understanding. The kind of person who knew exactly what to say when you were tired, stressed, or unsure of yourself. He had this way of making everything sound simple, like he had already figured life out and was just helping me catch up. I thought that was comfort. Looking back, it was control starting to take shape. We weren't loud in the beginning. These were no dramatic fights, no obvious red flags. It was quieter than that. He would correct my memory gently. He would remind me of things I supposedly agreed to. He would say I was overthinking when I brought up things that didn't feel right. And slowly, I stopped bringing things up at all. That's what I didn't notice at the time. Silence wasn't peace. It was conditioning. The first time I recorded a call, it wasn't planned. We were arguing about something small, something I can't even fully remember now, but I remember how it ended. He told me I had misunderstood everything, that I was making his feel unsafe in the relationship by not trusting his version of events. And something inside me just snapped quietly, not loudly, just enough. I hit record before the next call and never stopped. Over time, those recordings became something I didn't fully think about anymore. They just became part of my routine. Call comes in, I record. Call ends, I don't mention it. I don't threaten it. I don't even listen to most of them right away. I just kept them, like evidence I didn't fully understand yet. But what I did understand was this. Every time we had a disagreement, the story changed later. Not slightly, completely. And every time I tried to correct it, I was suddenly confused, emotional, or remembering things wrong. And the more I pushed back, the more isolated I felt inside my own relationship. The worst part wasn't even the arguments. It was the calm voice he used afterward. The one that made everything feel like it was my fault for even questioning his. That voice made me start doubting my own mind more than I doubted his actions. And that's when I realized something was off. Not in a dramatic way, in a quiet, unsettling way that I couldn't explain to anyone else. By month 3, I wasn't just recording calls anymore. I was listening back, and that's when the pattern became impossible to ignore. These were 2 versions of Lauren, the one he showed me in the moment, and the one that appeared when he thought I would forget. And those 2 versions never matched. I didn't confront his yet, because I wasn't ready, not emotionally, not mentally. Because once you realize someone is rewriting your reality in real time, the next question becomes harder to answer. How long has this been happening? And what else have they already made you forget? And that question was about to change everything. Looking back, I can't even say these were one moment that everything has started falling apart. It didn't happen like that. It was slower, almost invisible at first, like a crack in glass that only shows up when the light hits it in a certain way. Lauren didn't start as someone I distrusted. He started as someone I leaned on. That's what makes it complicated. Because when things are good in the beginning, your brain doesn't prepare for the version of that same person who might later twist everything you believe about yourself. We met through mutual friends at a small gathering. Nothing special. I remember he laughed easily, listened closely, and never interrupted. He made me feel like I didn't have to perform or explain myself too much. After a long stretch of feeling misunderstood in life, that kind of attention feels like safety. And I mistook safety for stability. That's whose I went wrong. At first, our conversations were simple, daily things, work stress, random thoughts at night. He had this way of remembering tiny details I mentioned once, like he was building a map of who I was. I thought it meant he cared. Now I see it differently. It wasn't just remembering, it was tracking. Not in a creepy way at first, but in a way that made it easier to predict how I would react later. What would calm me down? What would confuse me? What would make me doubt myself? I just didn't recognize it yet. The first real shift happened around month 2. I brought up something he said on a call that didn't match what he said later in person. It was small. I wasn't even trying to argue. I just wanted clarity. I thought it was a normal conversation. But he didn't respond normally. He paused, then laughed softly, and said I must have misunderstood. Not in a harsh way, in a gentle way, almost caring. Like I was the one who needed correction, not clarification. That moment should have stood out more than it did. Because instead of questioning it, I apologized. I actually apologized for misunderstanding, something I clearly remembered. That's the part I still think about. How quickly doubt can turn inward when someone else sounds completely certain. After that, things didn't escalate loudly. They adjusted quietly. Every disagreement started ending the same way. I would remember something. He would remember it differently. And somehow, the conversation would always end with me being the one who needed to relax or stop overthinking. It never felt like manipulation in the moment. It felt like exhaustion. Like I was always one step behind something I couldn't fully see. Outside of the calls, things looked normal. We still laughed sometimes, still made plans, still had moments that felt real enough to ignore the discomfort building underneath. That's what made it dangerous. Because if everything had been bad, I would have left early. But it was mixed, and mixed emotions keep you longer than bad ones ever could. The first time I almost ended things, I remember sitting in my car outside his place, just staring at the steering wheel. Nothing dramatic happened that day. No big fight, just a feeling. A quiet thought that something about the relationship was starting to bend me in ways I didn't fully understand yet. But when he called me later that night, his voice sounded soft, familiar, warm again. And just like that, the doubt disappeared. That's how it worked, not force, reset. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was starting to rely on his version of reality more than my own memory. Because every time these were conflict, he sounded more certain than I did. And certainty wins when you're already unsure. So I started trusting his tone instead of trusting my recall. That shift was subtle, but it was everything. Around month 4, I stopped arguing as much. Not because things got better, but because arguing felt pointless. No matter what I said, the story would get rewritten later anyway. And that's when something inside me started changing too. Not anger yet, just distance. Like part of me was stepping back and observing instead of participating. That's when I started listening to the recordings more seriously, not just saving them. Reviewing them, comparing them, and slowly I began to hear something I had missed before. Patterns in how he framed things, small shifts in wording, subtle changes that made his version always sound more stable than mine. It wasn't loud enough to prove anything on its own. But together, it started forming something undeniable. And still, I didn't confront his. Because part of me was afraid of what would happen if I was right. Because if I was right, then it meant I hadn't just been misunderstood. It meant I had been managed, carefully, consistently, for a long time, and that realization was harder to accept than any argument we ever had. That's also when I made a decision I didn't fully understand yet. I started keeping everything. Not just calls, messages, voice notes, timing, even how quickly he changed topics when something got uncomfortable. I wasn't calling it evidence yet. I was just afraid of forgetting what I knew in the moment. But deep down, something was forming. A record of reality I didn't fully trust myself to hold in my head anymore. And I didn't realize it then, but that decision was the moment everything started moving toward the end. The first real crack didn't come from a big fight or a dramatic moment. It came from something much quieter. A single phone call whose Lauren's voice sounded normal, almost warm, while he casually denied something I was absolutely certain had just been said the day before. I remember sitting these holding the phone, waiting for his to correct himself, waiting for some small acknowledgement that maybe he misremembered. But instead, he didn't hesitate at all. He just told me I was confused again, like it was a habit I couldn't control. That was the first time I felt something shift inside me, not loudly, but in a way that made me stop and replay the conversation long after it ended. Because I knew what I heard. I wasn't guessing. I wasn't unsure. But somehow, the certainty in his voice made my own memory feel weaker than it should have. After that, things didn't explode. They adjusted. Every disagreement started following the same pattern. I would bring up something he said. He would calmly deny it. Then he would explain how my emotions were affecting my memory. And slowly, without realizing it, I stopped pushing back as hard. Not because I agreed with his, but because arguing started feeling pointless when the outcome never changed. What made it worse was how normal everything still looked from the outside. These were still good conversations. Still moments whose he sounded caring, understanding, and even supportive. But those moments started feeling like resets. Like every time I got too close to questioning his version of things, he would pull me back into something softer, something familiar, and the doubt would fade again. I didn't notice at first how much I was starting to rely on his reactions more than my own thoughts. If he sounded calm, I assumed I was overthinking. If he sounded certain, I assumed I must have misunderstood. It wasn't something he forced directly. It just happened gradually, like I was being trained to trust his interpretation over my own experience. The real conflict began when I tried to bring up one of those inconsistencies more seriously. I told his I was sure he had said something different earlier, and instead of getting defensive, he went quiet for a moment and then told me I was starting to create problems that didn't exist. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue aggressively. He just made me feel like the issue wasn't his words, but my need to question them at all. That conversation stayed with me longer than it should have. Not because of what was said, but because of how easily my confidence in myself had started to fade during it. I remember sitting these afterward, replaying it again and again, trying to find the exact point whose I should have pushed harder, spoken clearer, stood firmer. But every time I replayed it, I ended up in the same place, doubting myself more than I doubted his. By the time the pattern became impossible to ignore, I had already stopped confronting his in real time. I would just nod, end the call, and sit in silence afterward, going back through recordings I had started keeping without fully admitting why I needed them. At first, I told myself it was just to remember conversations properly. But the truth was simpler than that. I didn't trust my memory anymore when it came to his. And the more I listened back, the clearer the contradiction became. The same conversations sounded different depending on when I heard them. In the moment, he always sounded certain. But on replay, I could hear the shifts, the small changes in phrasing. The way his version always seemed to place responsibility back on me without ever saying it directly. It wasn't loud manipulation. It was structured confusion. And it was working. The moment things turned from confusion into something heavier was when I realized I had started avoiding certain topics completely. Not because they weren't important, but because I already knew how the conversation would end. I would remember something clearly. He would deny it. I would question myself. And then I would end the call feeling like I had lost something I couldn't even explain. That realization didn't come with anger at first. It came with exhaustion. A strange feeling of being mentally worn down after conversations that should have been simple. And somewhere inside that exhaustion, a small, steady awareness started forming. If I kept relying on his version of reality over my own, these would eventually be nothing left of my own certainty at all. And that was the moment I stopped trying to win arguments with his and started trying to understand what was actually happening instead. The shift didn't happen in one moment. It happened in layers, so subtle at first that I almost missed it completely. But once I started noticing it, I couldn't unseen it anymore. Lauren didn't just disagree with me anymore. He started correcting me like I was unreliable. Not in an obvious, insulting way, but in calm, almost concerned tone that made it sound like he was helping me rather than challenging me. Every time I brought up something I clearly remembered, he would respond like he was gently guiding me back to what really happened. And the worst part was how convincing it sounded. Because it didn't feel like an attack, it felt like reassurance. Like I was the one spiraling, and he was the stable point trying to bring me back. That's when I started noticing something happening inside me that I didn't like. I stopped trusting my immediate memory. I started pausing before speaking, rechecking conversations in my head before I brought them up. It wasn't fear yet. It was doubt slowly replacing instinct. And once that starts, it spreads into everything, even outside of his. I would replay normal interactions from the day and wonder if I had misunderstood those too. That's how it starts to feel when someone repeatedly sounds more certain than you about your own experiences. You stop defending your version of reality because you start assuming it might be wrong. The recordings changed everything, but not in the way I expected at first. I thought they would confirm what I already knew. Instead, they showed me something more uncomfortable. In the moment, he always sounded reasonable, controlled, almost helpful. But when I listened back later without the pressure of the conversation, I could hear the structure underneath it. He never directly contradicted me at first. He reframed, shifted meaning, reorganized the conversation until my point didn't sound like my point anymore. It was subtle enough that you wouldn't notice unless you were actively looking for it. And once I started looking for it, I found it everywhere. The emotional tone always stayed calm on his side. Even when the conversation was tense, he never matched my intensity. That imbalance made me sound more unstable in comparison, even when I was. It created a pattern whose I looked like the emotional one, and he looked like the reasonable one, no matter what actually happened. That realization hit harder than anything else so far. Because it meant the arguments were never really about the topic. They were about perception. And he controlled perception better than I did. As time went on, I started withdrawing without even noticing it. Not just from his, but from others' people too. I became more careful with what I said, more cautious about how I explained things. I started second-guessing simple memories. Did he actually say that? Or did I misunderstand again? That question started appearing everywhere in my mind. And that's whose the breakdown began. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. In small moments of hesitation. Who do these used to be certainty. These were one night in particular I remember clearly. We had another disagreement, something small again, something that shouldn't have mattered. But afterward, I sat in my room and replayed it in my head for hours. Then I checked the recording. Then I listened again. And I realized something that made my stomach feel heavy. Even when I was right, I started feeling wrong. Not because of facts, because of repetition. Because when someone confidently denies your reality enough times, your brain starts treating confidence as truth, even when it is. That was the beginning of the psychological shift I didn't fully understand yet. And the most dangerous part was that I still didn't see it as manipulation. I saw it as confusion, which meant I was still trying to solve it like a misunderstanding instead of what it actually was becoming. Control. And by the time I finally started to recognize that word in my own thoughts, I realized something even worse. I wasn't just doubting his anymore. I was starting to doubt what his I could trust I at all. That was the turning point. Not the arguments, not the confusion, not even the recordings. It was the moment I realized I couldn't trust my own certainty anymore unless I had proof sitting in front of me. So I stopped reacting emotionally, and I started building something structured. At first, it was simple. I organized every recording in order. I labeled them by date, then by topic. Then I started cross-checking them with messages and notes I had saved over time. What I found wasn't just inconsistency. It was a pattern that kept repeating in a very specific way. Every time I challenged his version of something, the conversation would shift into me defending my memory instead of his explaining his. It wasn't accidental. It was consistent. And that consistency told me more than any single argument ever could. So I stopped treating it like a relationship problem and started treating it like a system. I created a private folder on my laptop and moved everything into it. Not just calls, everything. Messages, screenshots, voice notes, even timestamps of when certain conversations happened. I wasn't trying to win an argument anymore. I was building a timeline that couldn't be reshaped by tone or emotion. Because tone was his strongest weapon, and I needed something stronger. As I reviewed everything again, something else became clear. These were moments whose he wasn't just denying things. He was guiding conversations away from topics that would create contradictions later. Almost like he knew which areas would fall apart under scrutiny and steered away from them before they could be questioned too deeply. That's when I understood what I was really dealing with. This wasn't just manipulation in the moment. It was long-term control through narrative consistency. And I had been inside it long enough to not see the structure. Once I saw it, everything changed. I stopped arguing completely. I stopped trying to get clarity from his directly. Instead, I let his talk freely while I recorded everything quietly. No interruptions, no corrections, just listening. Because I realized something important. You don't expose patterns by fighting them. You expose them by letting them repeat. And that's exactly what I did. Over the next weeks, I let every conversation happen naturally. I didn't challenge contradictions anymore. I just documented them. And slowly, the differences between versions became too large to ignore. These were calls whose he clearly said one thing, then later insisted he never said it. These were moments whose his tone changed depending on what I agreed with. These were subtle shifts in responsibility that always moved the emotional weight back onto me. Individually, none of it would have been enough. But together, it formed something undeniable. A structured pattern of rewriting. Once I had enough, I stopped engaging altogethes and shifted into preparation mode. I organized everything into a clean timeline, not emotional commentary. Just structured evidence. Date, statement, contradiction, outcome. Simple, repeatable, verifiable, and then I waited. Because timing mattered more than confrontation. I knew if I approached it emotionally, he would reshape the situation again like he always did. But if I approached it with structure instead of reaction, these would be nothing to twist. That's when I made my final decision. I wasn't going to argue with his anymore. I was going to present reality in a form he couldn't reorganize. And the moment he saw that structure for the first time was the moment everything he had built started to collapse. The day it ended didn't feel like a movie moment. These were no shouting, no dramatic entrance, no emotional explosion. It felt quiet. Too quiet. I sat across from Lauren in a neutral meeting room I had chosen on purpose. Not his place, not mine, somewhere in between whose neither of us could use familiarity as comfort or control. I didn't start with emotion. I didn't start with accusations. I just placed the folder on the table, clean, organized, labeled, and I said nothing. For the first time in a long time, I let silence do the talking. He looked at it, then at me, and I could see the shift happen in real time. Not panic yet, not anger, something more subtle, calculation. He opened it slowly like he was still trying to control the pace of the moment. At first, he stayed composed. I could tell he was reading it like he always did with conversations, trying to reframe it internally before responding. But this wasn't a conversation, it was structure. And structure doesn't change based on tone. As he moved through page after page, the calm started slipping. Not suddenly, but in small cracks. A pause his. A reread these. A moment that's his eyes stopped moving for longer than they should have. Because he saw it. Not one mistake, not one misunderstanding. A pattern. A consistent, repeated structure of contradiction that couldn't be explained away individually anymore. And for the first time since I met his, he didn't have an immediate response ready. That silence meant more than anything he could have said. Eventually, he tried. He said I was taking things out of context. Those recordings don't capture intent. That memory is subjective. He started reaching for the same framing he always used. But it didn't land the same way anymore, because I wasn't reacting to his voice now. I was looking at repetition, and repetition doesn't care about tone, only consistency. That's when his confidence started breaking, not loudly, just enough that he stopped interrupting his own explanations. And then came the moment he realized something worse. He couldn't talk his way out of it anymore, because I wasn't asking his to explain. I was showing his already existed, and it didn't depend on his agreement. That's when he went quiet again, but this silence was different. It wasn't control, it was recognition. The final conversation between us didn't end in closure, it ended in distance. No more rewriting, no more shifting narratives, no more emotional resets that blurred reality, just separation. Clean, final, unavoidable. And after that, everything around it started collapsing in smaller ways. The versions of events he had maintained with confidence stopped working when people saw the same structure I had been holding privately for months. Not because I convinced anyone, but because patterns don't stay hidden when they're written clearly enough. And when it was all finally exposed, I didn't feel the satisfaction I thought I would. Thighs was no explosion of relief, no dramatic sense of victory, just stillness. Like something heavy had finally been set down after being carried for too long. In the days that followed, I kept going back to one thought. Revenge wasn't what I expected it to be. It wasn't loud. It wasn't emotional. It was clarity returning after confusion. And once clarity returns, you stop needing validation for what you already know. What I learned through all of this is simple, but it took me a long time to understand it. Control doesn't always look like force. Sometimes it looks like confidence repeated often enough that you start questioning your own memory. But truth doesn't disappear just because it gets questioned. It only gets delayed. And when it finally surfaces, it doesn't need to argue. It just exists. And that's enough. If this story made you think differently about trust, memory, or manipulation, let me know in the comments. I read every single one. And if you've ever been in a situation whose you started doubting your own reality, you're not alone in that. Like the video if you want more stories like this, subscribe for more, and click the next one on the screen. This is always another story waiting.